Let's talk more about this issue in agribusiness and how the industry has navigated the surging costs with Theo Boshoff, who's the CEO of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. Thank you very much, Theo, for your time this afternoon. And let's maybe start with that broad overlook as to how the value chains within agribusiness have dealt with the higher input costs, one of them being diesel. If it's not for generators, it's to transport the different goods that are produced in the sector.
Yes, no, thank you very much for the opportunity. And I think, as you mentioned, it really does affect multiple areas within the value chain. If you look at the most basic staple foods, the likes of maize, wheat, soybeans, it obviously goes into food as well as animal feed manufacturing. Most of this is transported by road. Upward of 17 or even to 80% of it is transported by road, simply because the rail infrastructure is currently somewhat unreliable. So you do have a big portion, and a big element of that does come down to transport, a huge one, in fact. If you were to consider a loaf of bread, roughly a third of the cost of that comes down to transport. And that's not only in one specific area, but that is both from the production side to getting it to silos, from silos to mills to bakeries, to eventually to the consumer. So there's this multiple value chain within transport that it does affect. And primary agriculture, it also does play a very big role, because we are currently still busy harvesting some of the last of the summer crop. The harvesting season for the winter crop is also will be nearing in the next few months. So typically in primary agriculture, diesel also a huge input cost, and again, in the sort of grains industry, it's estimated that it's between sort of 9 and 11% of the input cost come down to diesel for either planting or harvesting, or the combination of both. So the timing of the diesel price increase obviously does play an impact. It is currently, as I mentioned, quite intensive. There are periods of the year when there's less activity taking place, but when an increase does coincide with some of the peak activity period, as we see now, it can have quite a substantial impact. And then finally, the one that's maybe the most difficult to quantify the impact is right across the value chain, as you mentioned. Due to the electricity crisis, is of course burning diesel and generators for electricity.
Yeah, and that's an important point to pick up on, because I'm sure you've had various engagements with some of the members and different stakeholders across the value chain about how they are dealing with the higher input costs, because I'm sure a lot of them don't ultimately want to pass it on to the end user or to the consumer. Have they had to rely on more debt from the banks, which in itself is also tough because of the interest rates? How are they navigating the space, Theo?
So debt is an important instrument, and it is very important and it's at a very high rate currently within the agricultural sector. That's not in itself necessarily a bad thing, because it does also indicate that there's a lot of investment taking place in the sector. So as long as the debt levels, the debt to GDP levels within the sector don't go too high, and it remains manageable, it's not necessarily a bad thing. The challenges, as you mentioned, is that not kind of across along the value chain. The types of products that we're talking about now that are most affected by diesel inputs are staple products. And obviously, you did mention the price inflation that we have with that, and I think all the companies know, of course, from ethical considerations as well as consideration, one cannot pass all of these costs onto the consumer. So certainly, many businesses are taking quite a bit of a knock when it comes to that. We're trying, at least as far as possible, to absorb some of the costs, because simply the lowest LSM customers that do rely, or where they're spending a large portion of their spending is on basic food, right? And this is a delicate balancing act between remaining sustainable from the agricultural side, but at the same time, one has to also be very sensitive towards the consumer's ability to pay higher costs.
Theo, what would you say then is the outlook for the industry? This is bearing in mind the many headwinds that you and I have just spoken about. In the short to the medium term, do you think that they will find some form of stability and kind of, get used to the way that things currently are in South Africa, particularly when it comes to the energy crisis, and as an example, investment into alternative energy sources in the industry?
There's a great deal of investment going into alternative sources, but I think the challenge is especially on the primary level, it doesn't necessarily increase the income generation capacity of a business. If one takes a farming entity, for instance, taking on additional debt for renewable energy initiatives, on the long term, it might be able to pay off, and especially if it's required out of desperation to buffer yourself against electricity cuts, it's necessary. But it doesn't mean that you will earn more for the produce. So I think there is a concern that perhaps the affordability of renewable energy, and it has been touted, and obviously a lot of businesses up and down the value chain are investing heavily into it, but it does have limits, to when it might become unaffordable. So that is one way which businesses are addressing it. In terms of the outlook, prices does play a very, very big role. Many agricultural commodities obviously are freely traded on the JSE. So the prices are currently, as we've seen, unfortunately, as a result maybe of some of the global instability, especially in the grain sector, prices are relatively high to a large extent. That can offset some of the higher input costs. The input costs specifically have been rising for a number of years. Disaggregating them, of course, energy prices do fluctuate quite a lot. Labor costs have steadily been increasing with the national minimum wage adjustments. Shipping costs, especially for export, but also importing certain inputs that we can't provide locally, plays a very key role. But some of the critical elements, such as fertilizer, agrochemicals, reached quite a peak, a high last year, but have steadily been coming down. So as long as the prices remain firm, obviously demand is relatively inflexible, but as long as the prices remain stable, there's quite a positive outlook for the industry. So that does also help. I mean, we have one of, I think the second biggest grain harvest on record, which is projected. Obviously, the harvesting is still taking place. So generally speaking, it's not negative, it's not doom and gloom, but the rising input certainly is something one will have to look at. Energy prices, especially diesel linked to global oil prices, these things do fluctuate. But putting the focus back on maybe the domestic element, where some of the prices are added, like the road accident fund levy, which doesn't make sense to be paying that when you're burning diesel and generators. But there are certain taxes that maybe can help if we can remove or at least alleviate the burden somewhat. Hopefully that will also be able to be passed on to the consumer and result in stabilizing food price inflation.
Theo, thank you very much for that update. That is Theo Boshoff. He's the CEO of the Agricultural Business Chamber. They're speaking about the impact of higher fuel, diesel prices on the value chain within agribusiness.